Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, our topic is Grandmother Ayahuasca. We're going to look at the shamanistic realities, the magic and the mysteries associated with the use of ayahuasca. With me is Dr. Rachel Harris, who is a psychologist and the author of Listening to Ayahuasca, New Hope for Depression, Addiction, PTSD, and Anxiety. Welcome again, Rachel.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you. You know, throughout your book, you refer to Grandmother Ayahuasca,
Right.
not as a metaphor, but as a living being. And I have to say, a spiritual presence who has been a real force in your life and who was also, since you are a Western-trained psychologist, also the source of an existential crisis of sorts.
Yes, for me.
Yeah.
Not for other people.
Mm-hmm.
Other people I've interviewed, and they don't seem to have any conflict over being in a relationship with the spirit of the plant.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it's difficult for me.
Well, because, of course, you're also reporting to your professional colleagues.
It's a little embarrassing to talk about it. You know,
Yeah.
I did, the research I did was published, and I had a co-author.
Mm-hmm.
And the co-author was one of my research mentors who came out of a 30-year retirement to do this study with me.
Yeah.
And as we were getting close to publication, I said to him, you know, there really should be a third author here.
Mm.
And he understood completely what I meant.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did receive help from Grandmother Ayahuasca, and he was aware of it, and we worked with the information she gave us, and it made a difference in how we interpreted the statistical findings. I mean, I can't say it without laughing about it.
Well, and
made
of course,
a difference.
every Western-trained psychologist is trained to assume that when you're referring to a spiritual being, you're really just projecting your own inner subconscious dynamics.
Right, this must be my own inner voice. But I really assert, I've done a lot of inner work. This was not my own voice. I really knew that. And as much as I have a difficulty accepting the reality of it, I have to say that I've dedicated the last 10 years of my life to carrying out what I felt was her mission that she gave me. And I really rose to the occasion to do it. It's been a lot of work. And I mean, at one point, somebody asked me if I was working on my dissertation. And I did that 30 years ago. This is not my dissertation. I'm doing this for the fun of it. I did it in response to what I heard.
In other words, she told you.
Literally, the words were, do the research. Now, she didn't give me any more instructions than that. So I had certainly a lot of I just didn't doubt it at all. I just did the research. I did it the way that it made sense to me. So it wasn't like she told me exactly what to do, but it was clear to do the research.
Well, people who use ayahuasca and other psychedelics often report entering into a magical world. A world that's very different from normal Western everyday consensus reality.
Right, that's true.
Especially academic reality.
Yes, that's more so true.
Even more so because, let's face it, as a parapsychologist, I can tell you most people believe in ESP and psychic experiences and a spiritual world and survival after death. It's just the guardians of our culture who say that, you know, these things are not acceptable, at least from a scientific perspective. The guardians of the priests would say they're not acceptable unless our religion approves of them. But
yes, there's that caveat. You know, I really believe, I mean, this is where I really feel strongly that as a culture we need to be more accepting of these altered states.
Yeah.
And the Gallup poll and the Pew Research Group asked the general, you know, a random selection of the general population, have you had a spiritual or mystical experience? Half the people say yes, but they're not talking about it.
Yeah.
And so it's not raised, it hasn't changed the culture, but half the people, 1 out of 2, I mean, you would think that would change the culture to be more open to these unusual experiences. But if people are not talking about it, then the general public doesn't really know about it.
Well, it's one of the reasons that I do this video interview series, is to keep the conversation going.
Yes, thank you. We'll do that.
Yeah. And of course, your work with people who have experienced ayahuasca is that almost, I think you said 75% of them report a personal experience.
Ongoing relationship.
Personal relationship with a spiritual mentor who happens to be a plant.
Yes, a plant spirit. I mean, we hardly even know how to talk about it.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a little mind-blowing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's of all the findings in the research study, that was the one that was the biggest surprise. I understood that people improved psychologically in many ways and also became more spiritual, more interested in being closer to nature.
Mm-hmm.
People would want to move to live in a closer relationship to nature, but that they had this ongoing relationship with this plant spirit was, for me, mind-blowing.
Well, and surely, many people listening to a conversation like this are tempted to think to themselves what idiots they are to assume.
Except I'm one of them.
So well, let me just give you my take on it, and I think you wrote about this in your book as well. William James, great scholar, psychologist, student of religion, wrote about God this way, and he said, God exists ontologically based on pragmatic criteria.
Right.
And American pragmatism is basically that if it works, it's true.
Yes.
And God, therefore, exists because people who have God in their life have that experience of an ongoing relationship.
Right.
You see the effects. That's real. That's undeniable.
Well, I think this qualifies.
Mm-hmm.
There was a quote from Stan Grof that I included because he is one of these people who's had a wide range of experiences, shall we say.
Yeah.
And he said what was unique about his ayahuasca experience was this relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And he called it a therapeutic relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is what's unique about this medicine. Not that it's the only one. As you pointed out earlier, peyote, there's grandfather peyote, and some of the other plants have spirits as well. But of the psychedelics, this one is really prominent.
And every shamanistic tradition around the world, it involves having a personal relationship with spirit beings.
Yes. Yes, and there is this ongoing process of discernment with receiving help from spirit beings. See, I stutter on saying, I can hardly say it. But there was one quote from a shaman this is an elderly shaman. I mean, he's now over 100. And so there's translation involved here. But he was asked, how do I know what my decision should be? And he said, talk to the spirits. So there's this ongoing relationship. And a number of people I interviewed were literally living their lives based on what they felt was the guidance they were getting spiritually.
Yeah.
And, that's a little, it's a little out there for me. I mean, I do, in my own life decisions, I think about things a little bit more methodically. But these people were really following what they felt was their intuitive spiritual advice that they were getting from these sources.
In order to have a relationship with a spirit teacher, one needs to have a lot of trust.
Yes, and it's a strong belief, but it's an experiential belief. It's based on experience.
I'm under the impression that there can be authentic spirits who are not trustworthy.
Yes, and I interviewed someone from, it wasn't an ayahuasca circle. It was I can't remember which. It'll eventually come to me. It's from Cuba. It's one of the spiritual groups from Cuba. And I said, how do you know what spirits to listen to and what to let in to be incorporated? And he looked at me as if I were a complete idiot, which of course I am with this question. And he said, we clear the space so that only good spirits can enter. So that did the vetting process ahead of time. And shamans clear the space as well. So that there is some sense of discerning which spirits to work with and which ones not to. But that's beyond my pay grade. That's beyond my psychology degree.
Well, I think it's fair to say that when you become really proficient at anything, whether it's business or ballet, you're going to develop sensitivities to the subtleties and to the nuances of what you're doing that go way beyond the ability of the average person to discriminate.
Right, that's true. Yes, that's true, especially in the arts, where things are very subjective and very subtle often, but people make very fine distinctions. You know, I had the with my daughter growing up, I had the opportunity to sit in on many rehearsal sessions with her. And I don't know if you read about this in the book, but many different classical voice situations. And the most recent one is she's at the Metropolitan Opera with the chorus. So this is the top choral director in the world, basically. And he's making these very fine corrections. So in a group of, there are 80 members of the Metropolitan Opera chorus, and he'll point to one person. And I'm sitting in the room, God forbid I should be singing, I'm sitting in the seats next to my daughter, and he points to one person because he hears that he wants something different from them. I have no clue. It's just, it is as if he's hearing from a different world. And it's that refined a perceptive ability. And in this country, we sort of have forgotten that apprenticeship process. And that's how this conductor, he's almost 70 now, that's how he was trained. He did not come out of a conservatory. He was apprenticed to conductors. And so this skill was developed over decades. And we forget how long someone needs to sweep the floor in the craft studio before they can actually even start to throw a pot, for instance. And it's a very long process.
And it's fair to assume that shamans who enter into the realm of spirit, some of them at least will have the same subtlety of discrimination as this renowned choral conductor.
Yes, I'm sure they do in their avenue. And one of the part of the, I don't know how to say this any better, part of the graduation ceremony for one shaman was that there were 3 elder shamans watching him as he worked with people, and they had to agree on the diagnosis and the treatment. So there's that, there's a real test for this. Yes, it's mind-boggling how perceptual ability can be so refined.
But this was your experience throughout your engagement with the ayahuasca rituals and traditions. I'm a beginner with my perceptual training in these realms. I am a clumsy beginner, and so I am receiving help and learning to be more gracious and accepting about it. I mean, there was one point where I was in the midst of writing, and of course I was behind on my deadline, and I was writing about the most scientific parts of the neurological findings. And I was bemoaning the fact that I was probably 2 people away from the Dalai Lama, but I didn't know anybody who knew a cognitive scientist who was familiar with ayahuasca. A week later, I had a professor from Berkeley who was willing to read my chapter for me. And he had experience both as a neuroscientist and with ayahuasca. I mean, he was probably the only one on the planet practically. And he vetted that chapter for me. But that felt like help to me. Well, John Lilly, who was also a psychedelic pioneer, talked about echo, I think was his phrase, earth coincidence control.
Yes.
and again, it's part of the workings of Grandmother Ayahuasca or other highly evolved guides from the inner realms. As I think you used the phrase, the imaginal realms, which I like a lot.
Yes.
Different than imagination.
And that's not my phrase. That's Henry Corbin, a French philosopher who studied Sufism. That's his description.
And I like it a lot.
Yes.
But in this realm, the ability to kind of engineer synchronicities seems to exist.
Yes, it does. And I was grateful for the help I got with that synchronicity. There is this sense, in the last chapter where I talk, where I reached for this, this part of the mystery, is I quoted about a dozen poems, because it's the poets who have a way of capturing. And there's this one phrase, the mountain behind the mountain, the pointing to other worlds, other realities, that what we see here is just one aspect, but that there are other worlds coinciding with this world. And so there's some perceptual training that opens those other worlds. And certainly ayahuasca opens portals to other worlds. It's most reliably known as being the vine of the spirits. So the spirit world opens up, and people are able to communicate with people who have died. And so, one thing I have to say is my relationship with people whom I have lost, those relationships have greatly improved. I'm talking about a living relationship with somebody who died now 40 years ago almost. And yet I feel my friend's presence. This is someone I grew up with, so it was a childhood friend. I feel the presence of this person more strongly now as a result of the ayahuasca ceremonies. So there's been that inner opening for me.
And in all of the interviews you have done now with over 80 people who are here in North America who have taken ayahuasca, Westerners, magical kinds of experiences of a wide variety are common.
Right. Right, very common. There was one ceremony for me where I had, I know this is an old-fashioned term, a Rolodex, and I could call people up on kind of a dial phone and talk to them, people who had died. So I'm happily going through my own address book.
Your inner Rolodex.
My inner Rolodex, and I'm talking to people, and I got blessings from my one of my research mentors who had died a few decades ago, and I'm having a great old time. And then I get a little egotistical about it, and I try and call someone who was not in my direct circle, my close circle, and my hand got slapped. And the whole process was shut down. And Grandmother Ayahuasca basically said to me, "No, you're pushing it. You pushed the limits. I'm shutting this off." And it never opened up like that again. And I was put in my place, and I appreciate. I got a little egotistical about it. Well, let's talk to so-and-so, let's talk to Einstein, see what he has to say. No. So that was an interesting experience. They're not all terrifying or horrible or even mystical. Some are just plain practical. There's a teaching in that one for me. Yeah, I got a little too curious.
Well, it's an ongoing, active relationship.
Yes, it is.
And you began this research quite a long time ago.
Almost a full decade ago. The research itself took 3 years, another year for it to be published, and then the book took years to come together and really clarify what I wanted to say.
So this relationship that you have with Grandmother Ayahuasca has been continuous and ongoing for well over a decade. I'm going to guess closer to 2.
No, 1 decade is true.
Okay.
It's true, yeah.
That's still, a decade is a healthy amount of time. For you to be able to evaluate it.
Yes. And so I have to say, if we look at the effects, as you said, William James, what's the so-called real world proof of the pudding, so to speak, is, yes, I have really dedicated this last decade to doing this research and the writing and talking about and trying to understand how this works. And because I've been a therapist most of my life, that has been my lens through which I viewed this medicine. I mean, an anthropologist would do it much differently. But there's something very therapeutic about this relationship with Grandmother Ayahuasca that's quite different.
And yet it did trigger, and we touched on it briefly, maybe we can go into it in a little more depth, what you call an ontological crisis.
Yes, well, that phrase was developed by John Mack, who's the Harvard psychiatrist who researched all the abduction stories.
Yes.
Remember, he was hypnotizing people and helping them retrieve their experiences.
Yeah.
And he had no professional way to explain the material he was getting. I mean, there have been a lot of mysteries that have come up. I mean, and so he talked about this crisis in meaning. What do these stories mean? That he himself went through.
And he was a psychiatrist, and as I recall, he was a friend of mine as well.
You know everyone. And he got in trouble at Harvard.
Indeed, he did.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, he concluded that the reports of UFO abductees was akin to the kinds of reports that come out of the shamanistic literature as well.
Yes, hinting to other worlds. Yeah, the shamans have begun, well, I shouldn't say just the shamans. The one shaman who retired as a vegetalisto because Grandmother Ayahuasca told him, stop working with this medicine and paint your visions. And that's Pablo Amaringo. And so he had a perfect recall of his visions when he was in ceremonies. And so he painted these gorgeous paintings. But if you look carefully, many of the paintings have flying saucers in them. They have Middle Eastern architecture in them. They're quite complex. But the flying saucers are relatively new over the last couple of decades. And it fits perfectly with the ayahuasca cosmology. The shamans talking about being, this is more indigenous, about being married to pink dolphins who live in the rivers in the Amazon. And, having spirit wives that they go and they stay with at the bottom of the river and they live with. And
it's this kind
these
of
are other
lore
worlds.
that is why some of the 19th century anthropologists assumed that shamanism was a form of psychosis.
Yes, that was way back. Yeah. Well, now we're wanting to study what they know about the plants for medical purposes. We really treat each shaman now as a pharmaceutical library.
And not only that, we're taking a fresh look at the meaning of psychosis as well.
Yes, somewhat.
Somewhat.
Some of us.
Some of us are.
Yes.
I know Wilson Van Dusen was a psychologist who wrote about the presence of spirits in the world of madness.
Yes, that's a beautiful phrase. Yeah. And I remember working with someone who had a psychotic break during or immediately after a surgical procedure, which happens. And in part it's a reaction to the anesthesia. And but it was really a mystical experience. So if a psychologist was only working within this conceptual consensus reality, they would say, well, this is a drug reaction and, just how do you stabilize yourself and get over this? But it was a very meaningful experience for him, and it changed the way he saw his life and the world. And so when we talked about it much differently. It opened things up for him.
Well, there is this tendency in Western culture, and I think we're probably all, I'm going to bet that every single viewer of this video is guilty of it at one time or another, which is to try and interpret these experiences from a materialistic framework.
Yes, that's our world. And that training is rooted linguistically for us. I mean, we really are. I know I am really locked into it, and that's part of why it's such an ontological crisis for me to have relationships with this plant spirit. Yeah, my favorite thing about how language forms our reality and how we get locked into it so early is the Native Americans. The great mystery is the interpretation, the translation of their phrase for a supreme being, energy, whatever you want to call it. But that's not quite right, because our language is bound by nouns. We make nouns out of everything. And their language, especially the Navajo language, is verb-based. So to be accurate, it should be the great mysterious thing.
Isn't that nice? Yeah, I know you are inspired by my old friend Danny Alford
Oh, really? You know
Moonhawk.
everyone. I am inspired by this, absolutely.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like that song, I was born about 10,000 years ago, and there's nothing in this world that I don't know.
Or anybody you don't know, yeah.
Well, I don't want to get too egotistical about it, but yeah, he was a beautiful spirit. And
Yes, that comes through.
His point that he ended up setting up conferences between quantum physicists
Yes.
and Native American elders.
Right.
And one of the key points that they both began to agree upon is that reality is much more like a verb than a noun.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And yes, but we are so programmed to think in terms of nouns. It's quite limiting.
We thing things.
Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's gets us trapped into a kind of materialistic mindset. I think materialism is great as a tool, not as a metaphysics.
Yes, not as everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's something about the ayahuasca experience that opens up beyond our conditioning in many ways. I mean, this is the cultural ontological conditioning, so it opens us up psychologically and also philosophically.
Well, in a way, I think the whole psychedelic revolution, it came along right at the heels of the 1950s.
Yes.
At a time when the crust of society was weighed very, very thickly, and it just sort of blew that whole crust
It sure
off.
did, yeah.
And all of a sudden, you had a generation, my generation, to be honest.
Our generation.
Our generation, 20-year-old people who were becoming mystics.
Yes.
By the millions.
And we didn't really know how to translate that. I mean, we had dreams of this will make a better world, but we really didn't know how to translate that. And I don't think we did so well at that. I mean, if you saw the Haight-Ashbury section of San Francisco during the heyday of the love summer, and then saw it maybe 2 years later where it was completely burned out and filled with
heroin addicts.
Heroin and amphetamines.
Yeah.
It was really a sad sight. And so that's some of my stress on the importance of what happens after the experience. What do you do with this? How has your life changed?
Yeah. Can you integrate it?
Yes. Right.
Well, Rachel Harris, you have done a fine job exemplifying how it can be integrated. And for that, I thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure being with you for these interviews.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
And thank you for being with us.
Oh, you made me cry.